God, let this time of work and study be helpful and fruitful and have good application for our lives as we continue to move through the amazing events of the Reformation. So give us your Holy Spirit, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. The story continues as we learn about Martin Luther. I gave you a heads up. We're going to be looking at the Peasants War. Seems like we're a little low in attendance today. Maybe that scared some people off. As I said, we were going to talk about church and politics. Everybody's always, I thought that we'd have a packed house about that.
The sun's out.
Yeah, the sun is out. That's probably the problem right there. So, just remember what I'm doing here in this class. This is now our 11th session. We are to 1525. We're about probably halfway through. I didn't know how long it'd take me to get through, but your interest and just kind of delving into these things, it's really hard to just touch on them and move by. And so my role as a curator, what does a curator do? Well, that collect, organize, and present. Here's a curator. I don't know what ship this is, but she's kind of helping people see something and explaining something. So I think that's my role, is help you look at what Luther read and hear what Luther, look at what Luther wrote and said. What have you heard too? But look at these events. I'm pointing out some things that you might not have noticed before. But that's kind of my role. I'm taking books like The Resilient Reformer and the 3-volume Martin Brecht that I have in my computer, and I'm trying to pull out some gems and give them to you. So I hope that's happening for you. All of the classes are online in case you want to revisit something. So we are at what's called the Peasants War, but there's a couple of people that I just need to give you some information about at this stage in the venture, at this stage in the game. Frederick the Wise, who you now have gotten to know very well as the elector of the area of Germany that Luther was living in Wittenberg, the guy that got the university started in Wittenberg, who brought Luther, who protected Luther. Luther would have clearly been killed if it wasn't for Frederick the Wise. His autonomy, his political savvy, knowing just how far he could push the emperor, Emperor Charles, dealing with the Pope, dealing with all the political backdrops, and I scratch your back, you scratch mine, all of the intricacies of that. Frederick the Wise was a genius. But Frederick the Wise dies, 1525, and in that year he's very sick. He was very sick even at the Diet of Worms going back a few years. But he dies in May of 1525. What you should know is that's right during the Peasants War. So you've got to know that. I will introduce you to the next elector that follows, who is his relative, who's his brother, I think. Yes, and so we'll learn about him in the upcoming sessions, but that's important for you to have on board. This is something Luther says is very fascinating, because all the interaction we've talked about with Frederick, we don't know that they ever really met. We don't know that they ever actually talked. This is what Luther says. For that matter, I have in my whole life never spoken one word with this prince, nor heard him speak. Nor have I even seen his face, except once in Worms before the emperor. When I was being examined for the second time, not the main one, but the second time, or not the first one where he said I need more time, etc. It is to be sure that I have often with him, he's certainly spoken with him often in writing through Master Spalatin. So he wrote Frederick, dozens, tons of letters, and lots of correspondence. But it was probably Frederick's genius that he didn't get one-to-one with Luther, because he needed separation. But it's just intriguing, isn't it? It's kind of a weird thing. When you next, either this summer or in the fall, we're going to watched 3 Luther movies. The latest one with Joseph Fiennes as the Martin Luther, and then there's 2 other older ones. You got to really have some endurance to look at those old ones because they're not as entertaining as the newer ones. But content-wise, really interesting, especially as we've had this class. But anyway, in that latest one with Joseph Fiennes as Luther, they have Luther meet Prince Frederick, and Luther giving Frederick the Bible. And I loved it well. And Peter Ustinov plays Frederick in the new one. And he just does a masterful job. It's just fabulous. But it's such a touching scene. So we don't know it ever really happened, but I wish it, I sure hope it did. But nonetheless, this is what Luther says about Frederick. You just have to get on board because I don't want you to miss these people. John Bugenhagen is from Pomerania. Make me think of Darlene's Pomerania. I don't know if her family was, that family is from there. But this is northeast part of Germany. And he reads Luther's Babylonian captivity of the church. He doesn't like it at first. But the more he thinks about it, the more interested he goes to Wittenberg. He shows up and starts to take classes from Philip Melanchthon while Luther's in the Wartburg Castle. John Bugenhagen instantly starts to rise up. He has amazing gifts with administration, with practical things. He will be a very important person in taking the Reformation out beyond Wittenberg into other parts of Europe. And we'll talk some more about that as we get on. But just to show you how important John Bugenhagen is, he's really Luther's probably one of his closest friends. If you think about Luther as number 1 and Melanchthon as number 2, Bugenhagen would certainly be number 3. Although we'll have to put Katie Luther in there somewhere too. So this is what Lowell and Nelson say. Bugenhagen became one of Luther's close friends, but he also served effectively as his pastor. And that's something you want to think about. Okay, who's this Bugenhagen guy? Well, he's Luther's pastor. Luther confessed to him privately for the rest of his life. And he remarked that Bugenhagen was one of 3, along with his wife Katie and his colleague Philip Melanchthon, who could minister to his discouragement. So when Luther was discouraged, Katie, Bugenhagen, and Melanchthon. That was his inner circle. There, of course, is Philip Melanchthon, just to remind you what Philip looks like. To show you how important that he is, what you see here, which is very difficult to see in this light today, the sun is shining. Let's see, do I got it on as bright as it'll go? Yes. So, this is the altarpiece that was created by Lucas Cranach after Luther died. And what you see in the top left, I've shown this to some of you before in a picture. This is a baptism scene, a Lord's Supper scene, and then a scene of the keys. The pastor doing the office of the keys. And then here is Luther here pointing to Christ. Here's the congregation listening to him. You've got baptism, Lord's Supper, and the office of the keys. And the people in this, over here, you can't, well, let's see, I think I've got a closer up picture. What's that? You can, you can, let's bring the front ones down. Bottom right, bottom row. There you go. That's a little better. Good. Thank you, Pat. So this is the town church of this day. This is a picture I took when I was there. And here's the altarpiece that I just showed you a picture of. And so if you break it down, here's the middle altarpiece with Luther receiving the cup. The one on the left here, here's the baptism scene. And who does that look like? Melanchthon. Now it's interesting because Melanchthon was not ordained, but he's baptized. Very interesting. Luther said, I know he isn't ordained, but Frederick, you got to start having him preach sermons because he was so good. That's what Luther wanted Melanchthon involved. So you got the congregation here receiving baptism. And then on the other side, who does this guy look like? Go back, you guys. There he is. on the right, so it shows you how important he is. And what is he doing? He's exercising the office of the keys. Here he has a key in both hands. And this is a person more in a peasant's, which is, I want to show this to you because it relates to our subject today. And he's releasing him of his sins because he's kneeling and he's repentant. But here is a noble. He's still tied up with his sins because he's not repenting. And so now he's binding his sins, but forgiving him his sins. So, interesting. But Bugenhagen, very important. You got to know this guy. This is the bottom part. I love this. With Luther pointing to the crucified Christ. This is representative of the resurrection, and here's the congregation listening. And of course, Luther's pointing to Christ. So that's Prince Frederick passes away. He dies. Bugenhagen joins Luther's team, becomes incredibly important. So we've been talking about the more radical reformers, Andreas Bodenstein Karlstadt, and I want to tell you where he was at with the Peasants War. He stopped short of calling for violence, but he very much was behind some of the iconoclasm and, let's change things right away. We've talked all about that. So he separates from Luther. They have a falling out, and they never really quite reconcile. But then this Thomas Müntzer, he not only wanted change, and he was against the corruption of the religious authorities, he was also against the corruption of the secular authorities, and he called for out-and-out revolt. I'm not going to say he caused the Peasants' War, but I'm going to say he was really an important voice in it. Luther assumed that he was. Luther believed that Müntzer was really one of the people fanning the flames. So let's talk about we talked just a little bit 2 weeks ago about the Peasants' War. I just gave you a taste of it. Now let's really get into it. And my goal today is to do about 15-20 minutes, give you the whole scoop on the Peasants' War so you know about it. And then I want to talk about, so what? What does it have to do with us today? Okay? So, heard this phrase before? Timing is everything? This is one of the times Luther's timing was horrible. It really is the main problem, in fact. If you don't know, what Luther had to say to the peasants is probably second to what he said as an older person, where he was, sick and suffering and tired and cranky. Other than what he said, the things he said about the Jews, which we will treat and deal with, other than that, he takes the most heat, and this is the most difficult portion of Luther's life, and what he said to the peasants, he has been belittled and berated for probably more than anything else. So let's set the table here. The peasants, remember the feudal system? You've got the lords and the nobles and the princes, and they are in power, and they own most of the property, and so the peasants work, they pay taxes, they get a certain amount of food, but they have to deliver a certain amount of goods. It's that age-old system, and the nobles and the princes were pretty harsh to them, and their lives were really difficult. And so they write a list of complaints, over a dozen different peasants groups, and all of these groups were not unified. They were all different, but they come together and they write their complaints, they make their case known, and Luther is sympathetic to it. And so he gets pulled into this, I don't want to say, it's not just a secular affair, it's certainly a religious affair, but he gets pulled into this debate. I'm going to say it's a little bit out of his wheelhouse. He's a theologian and a pastor. He's not so much a politician. That's why Frederick was so important to him. But he writes Admonition to Peace because he's the most famous person in Europe. I mean, everybody wants to know, what does Luther say? So he writes a critique or a treatment of the situation, and it's very balanced. I've pretty much read the whole thing. It has much more to say to the peasants in the second half, but as far as its criticisms, it's, I think, quite balanced. We'll hear what it has to say, so you don't just hear me talk about it. So to the lords and nobility, he says, it's your fault. You need to listen to these peasants and you need to negotiate with them. That's in essence what he says. Let's hear some specifics. Because you got to hear Luther's language, right? I mean, we have no one on earth to thank. I think I read this last week, or 2 weeks ago. We have no one to thank for this disastrous rebellion except you princes and lords. In addition, as temporal rulers, circle that word in your mind, temporal rulers, you do nothing but cheat and rob the people so that you may lead a life of luxury and extravagance. The poor common people cannot bear it any longer. The sword is already at your throats, but you think that you sit so firm in the saddle that no one can unhorse you. This false security and stubborn perversity will break your necks, as you will discover. Well, that's pretty strong language. Surprise coming out of Luther's mouth. Well then, a little later he says, well then, since you are the cause of this wrath of God, it will undoubtedly come upon you, unless you mend your ways in time. The signs in heaven and the wonders on earth are meant for you, dear lords. They bode no good for you, and no good will come to you. A great part of God's wrath has already come. Look at the mess we're in. It goes on. The rest of it is now here. For the peasants are banding together, and unless our repentance moves God to prevent it, this must result in the ruin, destruction, and desolation of Germany by cruel murder and bloodshed. In other words, repent, folks in authority, or else look what's coming. And so what are they supposed to do? This is, again, the long writing. I'm giving you little snippets just to give you a taste here. If it is still possible to give you advice, my lords, give away a little to the will and wrath of God. A cartload of hay must give way to a drunken man. So I guess the drunken man would be the peasants, and the cartload of hay would be the princes and lords. How much more ought you to stop your raging and obstinate tyranny and not deal unreasonably with the peasants, as though they were drunk or out of their minds? Do not start a fight with them, for you do not know how it will end. Try kindness first, for you do not know what God will do to prevent the spark that will kindle all Germany and start a fire that no one can extinguish. That's his advice to the nobles. You think they listen to it? Part of the problem is that it's too late. Because what we'll see is that by the time admonition to peace, it's not like the internet today where you write it, it's out there. By the time it really gets out there, the war has begun. So it's not necessarily too little too late, but it's definitely too late. So that's what he says to the lords and nobility. So you're thinking at this point, well, he's on the side of the peasants, right? That's what it sounds like. But Luther's fair in his critique. And so now he says to the peasants, but you guys, you have to respect the authorities. No violence. Negotiate. And the gospel, and this is really important, is not justification to rebel against the law and order of the time. This is where this is going to stick in your craw. I know, coming up. That's good. So, let's listen to what he says to the peasants. Third, this is down the way in his argument. Third, you say that the rulers are wicked and intolerable, for they will not allow us to have the gospel. They oppress us too hard with the burdens. They lay on our property, and they are ruining us in body and soul. And just to put this in better context, one of Luther's areas on those 12 articles of the peasants is that, yes, you should be able to choose your pastors, and you need to have the gospel, and you should have evangelical pastors. So some of the peasants' complaints did have to do with religious matters. And Luther, yeah, that's good. But they didn't stop there. They went on to other things. And so they're ruining us in body and soul, the peasants say. I answer The fact that the rulers are wicked and unjust does not excuse disorder and rebellion. For the punishing of wickedness is not the responsibility of everyone, but the worldly rulers who bear the sword. Thus Paul says in Romans 13, and Peter in 1 Peter 3, I think we heard part of this text today on Sunday, that the rulers are instituted by God for punishment of the wicked. Then too, there is the natural law of all the world, which says that no one may sit as judge in his own case or take his own revenge. So Luther says, by you guys rebelling violently, by taking up arms against the authorities, you're making yourself judge and jury. You're combining those two. Now you cannot deny that your rebellion actually involves you making yourselves your own judges and avenging yourselves. You are quite unwilling to suffer any wrong. That is contrary not only to Christian law and the gospel, but also to natural law and all equity. What do you think about Luther's saying here? He goes on a little later. But see that Christ does and teaches in this case. However great the injustice was, he nevertheless stopped St. Peter, bade him to put up his sword, and would not allow him to avenge or prevent this injustice. In addition, he passed the sentence of death upon him, as though upon a murderer, and said, he who takes up the sword will perish by the sword. This should help us understand that we do not have the right to use the sword simply because someone has done us an injustice, and because the law and justice are on our side. We must also have received power and authority from God to use the sword and to punish wrong. So I'll finish, I'll say some more. Furthermore, a Christian should also suffer if anyone desires to keep the gospel away from him by force. It may not even be possible to keep the gospel from anyone, as we shall hear. What Luther is saying is that as Christians, God has put people in authority. It's their job to punish wrong, etc. As a peasant, you suffer for doing what's right, and you don't take up arms, and you work with those authorities, and you respect those authorities. So this is what he's saying, and at this point, I guess what we're hearing a little bit about is what Luther would talk about as two realms. There's the temporal and secular government that Paul is talking about in Romans 13. You have to respect that. They're put there by God to keep order, to have laws, to not have chaos, etc. And you have to respect those and live within those boundaries. But then you got the kingdom of Christ, which, that's the Beatitudes. That's you don't, return wrong for wrong. You don't return evil for evil. You go the extra mile. If somebody, if they persecute you, you're blessed for it. So Luther had these two realms working in his mind, and although they overlapped, he felt you needed to keep those separate. Now Thomas Müntzer is going to say, no, as a Christian, you've got to attack these authorities. They're doing wrong. So he's going to say there isn't a difference here. Like I said, it's a balanced critique of both sides, but it comes too late. And by the time it really gets out there, war has begun. And the peasants have taken up arms, and the arms for them were picks, forks, and axes against the swords and weapons of the princes. And so things start to break out. And once that happens, Luther changes his tune. Because Luther feels that this taking up arms is absolutely not the right thing. He's aghast that the peasants have taken up arms. And also in his mind, and this is a part of Luther that a lot of people don't know, Luther absolutely during his life believed that it was the end of the world. He believed the Pope was the Antichrist. He believed that Christ was coming again to intervene anytime, and he took this as a sign of think about Revelation and the horsemen and the death, the coming, and think about the Peasants War. By the time the Peasants War is over, historians estimate that 100,000 people were killed, and almost all of them peasants. That's a lot of people back in that day, in any day. Tom mentioned that you visited a site of one of the first battles, and there's an ossuary in a church. I was trying to get the picture, I couldn't pull it up. And 3,000 died in that one, correct? 6,000. 6,000. And it's still commemorated today, so they still think about that. So, Luther, though, really sees this as Müntzer's fault, but I think that would be an oversimplification. It was much broader than that. So this is from Martin Brecht, and I just wanted you to read what he says about this moment in time. Probably immediately after returning to Wittenberg on the evening of May 6th, remember, that's right after Frederick died, Luther added a section to the third Wittenberg edition of the Admonition to Peace, entitling it Against the Raging Peasants. So what happens is that Luther writes his Admonition to Peace. It's a little too late. The war has begun. The peasants are revolting. And now they can't do this. And so he adds to his writing in something called Against the Raging Peasant. Against the robbing and murdering hordes of peasants. So, well, let me go back. This section has become famous as well as infamous because of its numerous special editions, most of them appearing outside Wittenberg, which bore the title Against the Robbing and Murdering Hordes of Peasants. Indeed, Luther did stand by his admonition to peace, but now in the changed situation when the revolt had already broken out, he believed the peasants' earlier claim that they were willing to negotiate was a lie. At the very least, alongside the peasants who were willing to negotiate, there were also raging peasants. Luther believed that it was primarily Müntzer, the archdevil of Mühlhausen, who was coming to the fore in his devilish work of robbery, murder, and bloodshed, and leading the peasants astray. Note what Martin Brecht says here, that Luther really saw that there was a difference between the peasants who were revolting and the peasants who were kind of being forced to come along. And in fact, that becomes a reality that some peasants were made to fight. And so that even makes Luther angrier at those really radical, violent peasants in their revolt. So he calls Müntzer out in this Against the Raging Peasants writing. And Müntzer, though, he has his words to say back to Luther. Let's hear what he says. He says that Luther, whom he calls Dr. Liar, and in German the word for liar is Lügner. So there's a play on words here. Luther Lügner. Dr. Lügner instead of Dr. Luther. Writes what the princes want for money. He is indulgent about their faults in order to eat his fill of their wealth and honors, and especially of the fine-sounding titles at their disposal. This is from Lowell. It ended with what might be considered a prophecy or curse. "Oh, Dr. Lügner, you wily fox, with your lies you have saddened the heart of the just man, for you have strengthened the power of the godless evildoers, so that they can continue on their old way. Therefore your fate will be that of a fox that has been hunted down. The people will go free, and God alone will be their Lord." God alone will be their Lord. So Müntzer basically says, you're just on the side of the princes. Now, he's said some pretty harsh things to the princes, hasn't he? But that was Müntzer's thing. So you're just in league with the powers that be. So Luther's response, though, in this next writing is that now that violence is breaking out, the authorities, you have to do your duty, and you have to put this down. So this is going back to Brecht, what he says. Finally, Luther turned to a special problem. The peasants were forcing others to go along with them. Such fellow travelers were likewise guilty, for a Christian should rather die than give a hair's breadth of support to the peasants' cause. precisely for the sake of these fellow travelers who were in the bonds of hell and the devil. What fellow travelers he's talking about? He's talking about those peasants who were forced to fight and to go along. The authorities were obligated to step in. It was in reference to them that the harshest words in the work were written. And here's the famous words. Therefore, dear lords, here is a place where you can release, rescue, help. Have mercy on these poor people. So what poor people? Those poor peasants who are being forced to fight. Let whoever can stab, smite, slay. If you die in doing it, good for you. A more blessed death can never be yours. So this is what he says to the princes. Because the peasants are forcing other people to fight, and they're dragging them in. So he says, you got to do your duty. And so he uses these very hurtful and difficult words. So what happens? These are the points Luther makes. Peasants broke faith, and he attacks against some of them. So his attack is against some of the peasants, not all of them. And these peasants are saying they are a Christian association, that this is their Christian duty. They're fighting a religious war. And Luther feels like this is an abuse of the evangelical name. He does continue to call on the government. He says, if you're a Christian government, you should listen to the cries of these peasants. But he also says, because of the extreme situation and all order is being lost, you have to fight and you have to stop them. And in particular, in regard to those peasants who were being victimized by other peasants, he tells the authorities to kill, smite, slay. So that's hard enough. And even princes were taken aghast at Luther's language. Martin Breck makes the point that Luther's good friend, not too long before this, had been killed by an angry mob. And that Luther's coming out of that anger about what this mob did. That's psychologizing and not sure if that's exactly what was going on. But here's the worst horrible thing. The timing of, like I said, timing is everything. The timing of the publication is horrible. Guess when it comes out? After basically the war's won. And the princes have put down the revolt, and they've killed all these hundreds, thousands of people, and now they're being vengeful, and they are throwing people in prison and raising taxes, and right about then is when this writing comes out. And what do you think the peasants hear? Kill, smite, slay. Horrible time. So what are the results of this? So the ramifications, and then I want to make some connections to today. Often in Luther's day, if you're in Reformation circles or with other Christians or whatever, his kill, smite, slay is taken completely out of context. You don't hear anything that he said to the princes. You don't hear anything of the rest. You just hear that. So it's taken completely out of context, and I think it has to be taken within context. Even though I certainly wish he wouldn't have said it, and I think he lost himself and he was afraid and angry, etc. But he, from this time, he loses support with the peasants, whereas he had it before then, because he's attacking the authorities, right? So they are totally behind him. And from now on, really, I don't want to say he loses their support completely, but it's certainly strained relationship. Let's put it that way at best. Other historians say that this war set the cause of the peasants back over 100 years, and they get disengaged. They go back to, just survival mode. But Luther does continue to warn the princes and lords and believes that their lack of the free reign of the gospel, and the corruption of the church and state is by the authorities is what caused the war. He doesn't stop that. Luther does become much more pessimistic about worldly government and affairs, and he's very much, it's a part of why he thinks the Lord's coming any second. But he doesn't give up, and he carries on. Let's finish with some Breck here. After the Peasants' War, Luther's relationship with the peasants remained strained, not least did their unwillingness to support their pastors and their forcing up the prices of foodstuffs, I'm not exactly sure even what that is, contribute to this. For Luther, however, the damage that the Peasants' War and the enthusiasts, that's those radical reformers, had caused the evangelical side did not lie in the fact that the Reformation had ceased to be a broad popular movement. He never spoke that way, and in fact, that was not the case. But rather, that the restoration of the old faith had picked up. That's the Catholic side. So, the Reformation movement had been damaged, and now people are going back to the old faith. Unperturbed, he employed his polemics against this turn of events and continued to build the Reformation church. The appearance of the prophets, enthusiasts, and fanatics certainly gave him difficult trials and crises. But in view of the task which he had set for himself, these events fundamentally changed nothing. He had already demonstrated by the surprising step of getting married, we're going to talk about that next week, that both personally and as a reformer, he was intending to continue on the evangelical course. So he carries on. He carries on through this. So when you look at what he wrote to the princes and to the peasants, and what the treatment and Martin Breck and Lowell and some others, I wrote down some principles about how Luther felt Christians should relate to the temporal world. I'm going to put them up here, and then I want to hear what you think. And then we're going to do some specific subjects. Christians are called to respect the authorities, the law of the land in which they live. Luther didn't know much about democracy, but you see some principles there, which is interesting. So we live in a totally different governmental system and economic system too, but he believed that you needed to respect those people who God had put into authority. Peaceful resistance and negotiation is the key, and that if you have to suffer for doing what's right, then that's what you do. He said, don't confuse the two realms, the right-hand kingdom, the left-hand kingdom of God, the right hand of the gospel, the left hand of temporal government. And you cannot claim the gospel as justification for violence, violent revolt. Christians suffer wrongdoing as an example and a witness. Those in authority, power, they must care for the lowly and resist self-interest. So, as he talks about the common person, he also is charging those people in authority. You don't use your power to hurt and oppress, and that's the whole problem. But he didn't want to undo the whole system of having people in authority in places, etc. These are some principles that I see coming out of this. I want you to know that I see, like, okay, well, Luther, what would you have thought, what would you have said in the American Revolution? And Luther, what would you have said to all the myriad of situations where people are genocided by a government? Sonny's sitting over there, he grew up in the Armenian, genocide. So, Luther, what would you say then? I don't know the answers to that, but that's what you're going to help me with. So, I want to hear, let's do large group first. What do you think of these principles? What do you think about what Luther had to say? Does it make sense? That's too tough of a question in a large group. Let's do that in a small group. 2 or 3 minutes. In each of your groups, what are the positives? What are the negatives for you about these principles? I'm going to leave them up there. I want you to think and engage with them. So let's do small group, just a couple minutes, because I want to get to some specific subjects. So take a minute in your person next to you if you're in the back, or if you're up in the front, you got in one of the small tables or round tables. What do you think? What's the positives? What's the negatives? And it's okay if you have nothing to say. You're just, I know, you gotta engage, you gotta work hard. What's the positive? What's the negative? Positive, negatives, questions. Keep going. Positives, negatives, questions. Couple more minutes. Seconds. All right, I'm gonna pull you back together. Can I have the mic runners? Oh, I love it. You're engaged. I love it when I can't pull you back out to the large group. Large group, let's, a couple things, share a little bit with me, and then let's look at some specifics.
We just had a question about the nature of people's religion in this time. We were trying to figure out, are they Catholic? The princes are supporting the Catholic Church in a lot of ways.
Great question.
Are they Catholic? Are they Lutheran or something?
Some are Lutheran, and some are Catholic.
But aren't almost everybody that are superstitious, aren't they all religious?
Yes, they are all religious. They're either Catholic or they are evangelical, Lutheran. People are being called Lutherans now, so some were and some weren't. Yep. Like Prince Frederick was on the evangelical side. George was right next door. A relative was totally against Luther. So.
Bill, I think the concept of the two realms allows people to have an escape valve between the two realms. And also to provide a sense of context for your activities within the two realms.
Okay, good. Say more about the escape valve, if you don't mind.
For example, if someone is involved in something in the secular world that runs up flat against the gospel or the spiritual realm, they have a way of justifying their behavior as long as it's not too egregious.
Right? Good point. And I'm sorry if this is too close to home, but knowing your background, Tom, but for Luther, this was when he counseled people in the military who had pangs of conscience. I'm going to be going to fight the Turks. I'm going to be killing people. Can I do that as a Christian? Luther said yes, because that's the different realm. And that's why you can do that. Other Christians don't separate those as much. The really important movie, Hacksaw Ridge. That person comes out of a Christian tradition that doesn't have those separations. So, yeah, so that's an example of what you're saying. Good, good. Yes, Kim?
Well,
Hold it close.
So, this list is very biblical, and we've discussed, you know, how to live with the government if
Right.
you're an oppressed person. But these things also assume that the government is just. And so I think that's when revolution happens, and certainly like in our American Revolution, it was decided that it wasn't a just government. And so that's really subjective, you know, at what point
Yes.
do you reach that?
Yes,
And,
right.
But
Yeah.
anyway, that's what we were discussing.
No, that's great. That's a great thing. And the interesting thing, though, with this, by the way, I think that's a very, when it comes to, as a Christian, when do I go outside the set system? Like if I was living somewhere where, you know, it was a dictatorship and they were doing all these things and they said to me as a Christian, I've got to do this. I mean, I'd have to draw the line somewhere with that. But Luther, he had no illusions that the princes were really doing their job. In fact, he felt they weren't. You've read it, right? So they were not being just, but they still had their position, and Luther believed that they were not so egregious, that they couldn't be worked with, that it couldn't, diplomacy couldn't, that there was still an avenue for the peasants to be heard and that for change to happen. So no, it's a very helpful comment. Did I see any over here? Before, yeah, go in the back and Bruce, and then we're going to look at, let's bring this to bear onto some specific things, just to stir you up a little bit. Yeah.
Peaceful resistance and negotiation reminds me of Martin Luther King.
Okay, good.
And, you know, basically, we do have a democracy, even though sometimes it gets messed up. But I think he had, you know, I'd seen the movie about him and stuff, and he had his flaws, but to me, he had the right idea about peaceful resistance.
Excellent. Nice transition for me. Perfect. Thank you. So, Martin Luther King Jr. has always been kind of a hero for me. I was born in '63 when he was killed. But, you know, as I've read him and, you know, and I've read a fair amount, I suppose, I got to get on my soapbox a little bit with him, is that what I see happening in our country with him is that many, because we live in this secular temporal realm, that they're trying to talk about Martin Luther King devoid of his biblical religious grounding. Gandhi was very important for Martin Luther King Jr., but Gandhi was not the main impetus for Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr., it was the Beatitudes. It was the prophets of the Old Testament that really caused him to focus. And when he talked about nonviolent movement, before it was Gandhi, it was Jesus. He quotes Jesus. So that's what motivated Martin Luther King Jr. And I think he had something right with Luther, the other Luther. Though, 500 years ago, Luther, our namesake, is that Luther felt like, no, you don't resort to violence. You do peaceful resistance. You keep negotiating, you keep fighting, and then if you have to suffer for it, you suffer for it. That's a witness. And I can tell you that, as someone growing up after the civil rights movement, as far as getting into adulthood, I've seen all those pictures, and, that changed my life. I still, every time I go back and watch a historical piece, and I just go, I can't believe we did this. I can't believe the water hoses, I can't believe this, and I can't believe the bus. You know, I just, that moves me to change. There are other violent movements, you know, well, I'm not going to go into that, so, because I'm not an expert on that, but I just think that that has made a huge impact. That's a great example of working within the system. The law was wrong, and so they resisted. They did break the laws, so that's interesting, but they didn't resort to violence. And I think that's, so the second one I put up was the Civil Rights Movement. You know, how does this square with Luther's principles? Well, I think a lot of them fit, you know, really well. Let's do one that's more current. President Trump just signed an EO, an executive order, giving religious leaders the permission to endorse candidates from the pulpit. They've always had the freedom to do that, but you threaten your tax-exempt status if you do that. There's no, you know, this is a free country, you know. So just so you know, next week, I've got my voter guide. I've got a whole new lease on my car. I'm so excited. Don't you want to know who I'm voting for? But how does that, regardless of the executive order, of whether you can or can't, what do you think Luther would feel if he was in a democracy, which he probably couldn't even conceptualize? What do you think he would feel about his Lutheran pastors getting up in the pulpit and saying, you guys should sign this petition on gun control? I don't know. Or you should sign this petition relating to, some more even, the immigration issue. You should. Let's get the church together to write all of our representatives to pass such and such. What do you think Luther would think about that? And I don't know the answer, but I'm interested. What do you, given what you've seen, how Luther felt the Christians should relate to the temporal government, what would you think about? What do you think he would say about that? Yeah.
If what you said is based on Scripture, I think he'd approve of that. If it wasn't, it was your personal opinion based on personal spiritual.
Okay.
Scriptural basis.
Okay. Good. Others? If it was based on Scripture, Bill, right there, coming to you. Yeah?
I think you get a slippery slope. You are on a slippery slope when you start to say, in John, in Peter, this is therefore how you should vote in your election and how you should approach immigration and so on and so forth. It's a wonderful concept that, oh, we should get our guidance. We come here and we know what to do.
Yes.
But I think Luther also said that there's two separate worlds here. There's the secular and there's the religious. And he was sort of, to me, hinting that, you know, there should be some separation here. We should have some common sense. And it's not that we can't be involved, but I think it's a very slippery slope.
Excellent.
And I don't pay attention to all his executive orders either.
You might not even know that he's talking. But no, it's a great, these are both very helpful comments. Others? Any others? You know? What do you, yeah, please. Oh, that's okay, whichever. Yep.
I would kind of take the other view that at that time the pastors were almost the leaders of the community.
Yes.
So if they decided they were going to take some point of view, the people would do it. They'd go. I mean, you have an illiterate population.
Yeah.
They didn't read or write.
Right.
And they took the word of their pastor is from God.
Okay. Good. And it's very true. They did not have the kind of separation that we have in our thinking. Although even in our thinking, I think that, you know, the Establishment Clause, You shall not make a certain religion the religion of the state. And from that, and I guess what Jefferson's Federalist Papers, we've come up with this, we gotta have can't have God in the secular realm and all this, which is probably not what was intended originally. But anyway, so we do live with more of a separation, certainly, than they did. So in their time, yeah, get involved, good, helpful. I've seen some others, please, and then, oh, I can't believe we're at the end of time. Yes.
Well, anyway, I believe it is a slippery slope, but there are certain things, I think, the church has an obligation as Christians to uphold a morality.
Yes.
And there are certain things in the Bible that are fairly explicit, such as abortion. I feel pretty strongly about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's certain things, I think, that as Christians, there's things that we can do. I mean, after all, this country was founded on Christian principles.
Right, yeah. Very helpful, good. We're going to go to Chuck, and then I'll finish us off. At the very back there, Doug, yeah. There we go. Jim.
Well,
go ahead, Chuck.
I think when we're talking about the preaching from the pulpit, let's say, if we're going to use the gospel to further an individual's or even a denomination's opinion,
Yeah.
belief,
Yeah.
that's the dangerous area, because we're talking about secular involvement in laws and whatever. If we're talking about the preaching and teaching of the Word, and not relying on the faith of God to resolve our difficulties,
Yes.
then I think that's where we hit the slippery slope. Our trust is in God, not in our own will, our own ability
Yes.
to make that change. We
Ah.
have to trust in God making those changes.
Ah.
We can talk about these things. That's why I think there's a difference between religious leaders being vocal about political issues outside the pulpit, but preaching to a congregation
Okay.
inside the pulpit. That's my difference.
Yeah, no, very helpful. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so give me 2 minutes. Give me 2 minutes. This one would have been a fun one to look at here, too.
I was waiting for that.
Sorry. Well, we can start there next week. Maybe I'll save that one for next week. Let's do that, okay? Will you come back, or was this too comfortable?
Bring a friend.
Yeah, bring a friend. This one, I think this one has a huge application, and very fascinating. So, all right. So let me finish us without going there. Let me just say this. I think it's the obligation of the church and pastors to talk about morality. But each church has to draw a line sometimes about then getting into, okay, therefore, since you believe in justice, you will do this, or you should do that. If it's scriptural, well, here's the thing. I've talked to our synod bishop and our church-wide bishop personally, and we've had conversations about this, and when I say, I think you're getting way too much into politics, they say, we're just preaching the Bible. We are doing exactly what Jesus said. When we are talking about immigration, we're doing exactly what the prophet Micah or whatever said. When my other conservative friends, Pastor Bill, how come you're not talking about, again, legislation and putting Supreme Court justices that will overturn Roe v. Wade? Do you believe in abortion? Do you think that's good? Shouldn't you be preaching about that? And they say it's in the Bible. I've known you since my mother's womb. It's in the, I've known you since your mother's womb. It's right there. I mean, what's a guy to do? What's a gal to do? What's a pastor to do? Well, my line, going with the two realms, is I talk about morality, and we live in a country where you have a voice. So if I start taking sides, we're going to have a congregation of Republicans or Democrats. And I'm going to tell you, in my opinion, in a lot of ELCA churches, it's a congregation of such and such. But in a lot of other churches in the evangelical world of today, it's a congregation of Republicans. You know, I can say that as an ELCA pastor, well, I won't go into that. So it's tricky, but some congregations are so fired up, and they are of one mind, and they get involved. Like Randolph in our congregation, you know, he comes from the South, and you know, the black church, they talk about all these issues, and I guess if you disagree, it's okay, I just disagree, and I'm still in the church, and it's fine. And that's a model too, and I actually have a lot of admiration for that model, but I think that the challenge for me is I'm going to preach morality, I'm going to let you go vote. I'm going to let you go sit on the Democrat or the Republican or the Independent or the Libertarian caucuses and form the platforms, and I'm going to let you get involved. I've had many pastors say, but Bill, the Lutherans have been pacifists, they've been quietists in the past, they haven't been involved, look at the civil rights movement. And I say back to them, how do you know they were quiet? Did you know how they voted in the voting booth? Just because they didn't go out all as a church and march together, do you know that they weren't marching? I don't know. I'm not making defense. I'm saying, so, and I'm not saying I've got it right, but this is the struggle. This is the struggle. And I love the fact that this is a congregation that's very diverse in its political affinities. And we've been able to hold that together. And as long as I don't follow the new EO, the executive order will be fine, right? So anyway, but know that as I read the Peasants War, I can't help but think about this, right? What Luther said to those peasants and what he said to the Lord. Like, for instance, I'd be so excited if our congressman was a part of our congregation. I wouldn't single him or her out, but it'd be cool because they're out there in the world. But you're out there in the world the same way. Go write your congressman. It's a man in this area, so go write him. He answers your letters. He will. You know, I mean, go do it. I'm not going to tell you what to write. If you want to take me to Starbucks, I'll tell you, and you buy the latte, I'll tell you everything you do. But I'm not going to tell you here, because I think that crosses a line. Okay, that's it. We got to quit. Thank you. Great class. Next week we'll have the post-over situation, and then we'll move on. We'll get to marriage.